Welcome back! Today we're going to be talking about a special category of Shakespeare's work that is lost, forgotten, and apocryphal. So everybody knows the big plays, everybody knows Romeo and Juliet, everybody knows Hamlet. Some of Shakespeare's plays, though, are a little more obscure, that they don't get as much attention. When was the last time you read King John or Cymbeline? Yet if you become a Shakespeare enthusiast, you may know some about those plays as well. And yet, in spite of Shakespeare's enduring fame and significance on the literary world, there are some works of his, or at least attributed to him, that you may never have heard of. Today I'm going to talk about those works, particularly the Shakespeare plays that are recognized by historical record, but we don't have anymore, the lost plays. Shakespeare plays that are often overlooked or questioned whether they are really authentically Shakespeare's, or have some other kind of issue with them, the forgotten plays. And finally, those plays that aren't Shakespeare's at all, but were attributed to him at least at one time, the apocryphal plays. Let's start with the lost plays. There are two plays considered to be lost. The first one is famously Love's Labour's Won. It sounds very much like it might have been a sequel to the comedy Love's Labour's Lost. After all, Love's Labour's Lost ends on a sad note. Although it looks like it's going to be a comedy, all of a sudden at the very end, the guys don't get the girls. They have to wait for a year and a day before they'll have another chance. Was Love's Labour's Won the sequel to that? Was it the moment that they finally were able to get married? There have been a lot of other theories about it, including such ideas that it might be an alternative title to Much Ado About Nothing. But most scholarly consensus says it's a play whose manuscript was lost in history. The second lost play is generally called The History of Cardenio. It was a late play written with John Fletcher, and it was pulled from source material in Cervantes' Don Quixote. There are lots of complex theories about Cardenio and what happened with that, and if you're interested, you should watch my video over it. It's always sad to think that Shakespeare may have written some great work, and we never get to read it because it was lost or destroyed. But although some plays seem to be lost forever, there are a few plays that we didn't originally attribute to Shakespeare, or had a weak attribution to Shakespeare, but we have eventually, with consensus, decided that at least Shakespeare had a hand in them. Since you may not find them in a complete works of Shakespeare, like the Norton Shakespeare, I'm going to call them the forgotten plays. Even Norton will reference them, but very frequently they are not included in their entirety. I'm going to start with the play Pericles, and although that one is usually included in an anthology of Shakespeare, it wasn't included in the first folio that Shakespeare's friends put together. And there's a lot of debate about why. No one really knows. Was it because it was co-authored and they didn't think it was as important? And yet that argument doesn't find perfect ground because there's other plays that are clearly co-authored. Two Noble Kinsmen get similar treatment because clearly Shakespeare wrote some and Fletcher wrote some. And that was hard for the generation after Shakespeare. For the next 100 years after Shakespeare, Shakespeare's name was becoming more and more famous. He had achieved quite a lot of fame in his own life, but it definitely grew after his death, to the point that in the early 1700s he was basically deified. And during that time, it was very hard for a lot of people to swallow that Shakespeare would co-author something with someone else. Because after all, this is Shakespeare we're talking about, not some puny Fletcher or Middleton. When in reality, Shakespeare was a guy just like anyone else, and he was just making a living. He was a brilliant, brilliant man with an amazing mind, but he was just trying to write plays and make money. And the more scholarship has looked into the way the theater worked back then, the more we see how much co-authorship was a thing. The real forgotten plays, though, are Edward III and Sir Thomas More. Edward III is a history play that people took a long time to attribute to Shakespeare. It's because Shakespeare probably only wrote one scene in it. But that is interesting because it doesn't seem like Shakespeare contributed a whole lot to Henry VI Part 1 either. But probably because Shakespeare's contributions to the other two parts of Henry VI are so much more extensive, people didn't have much problem including Henry VI Part 1. Edward III is not my favorite of the history plays. The second half is honestly a little bit boring. But there is one really good scene, and it does seem like that scene was from Shakespeare, according to stylistic and linguistic analysis. Perhaps an even more interesting forgotten play is Sir Thomas More. Shakespeare didn't write the original play, but the original play was presented to censors who chopped it completely apart and said, this isn't going to work, there's a riot scene up here that's not gonna fly, there's this little element of xenophobia, and we've got some international tensions going on, this isn't going to work. And so the chopped up censor copy was passed back to the theater. Some years later, it was then rewritten. Significant sections were rewritten by a range of playwrights. One of those playwrights was Shakespeare. The whole story behind that play is fascinating, and you should watch my video over it if you're interested. I might also throw Timon of Athens in there as well, because that play feels very unfinished. It seems to be more of a manuscript play that Shakespeare was co-authoring with someone else. But it's gotten enough credit that it's generally included in anthologies. Finally, I'd like to talk about the apocryphal plays. There were several plays in Shakespeare's day, or right after his death, that began to be attributed to him. The process of printing a play didn't usually have a lot to do with the playwright. Often, the manuscripts were collected from actors or from other sources and were sent to the printers, without even the permission of the playwright. And it seems that some printers started slapping the name William Shakespeare on random plays in order to sell more copies. A lot of these quarto copies of Shakespeare's plays have given us lots of information about the way he wrote and also sometimes edited his plays. But one of the most important resources for us in studying Shakespeare is the First Folio. A few of Shakespeare's friends put together his complete plays, in theory. This was in 1623, shortly after his death. In 1632, a second folio was put out with the same plays, they were just edited a little bit. Then we had Oliver Cromwell and all that mess. Finally, we come back into the Regency, and the theaters open back up again, people are excited about Shakespeare again, and so a new edition of the complete works of Shakespeare comes out called the Third Folio. This is in 1664. And guess what? The Third Folio contained 7 new plays by Shakespeare. Only they weren't by Shakespeare. Well, okay, Pericles is included in there, which is why I consider it a forgotten play. His friends left it out before. But the other 6 plays are considered not Shakespeare at all. And you can go read them, they're not that good. The 6 other plays included were The London Prodigal, Thomas Lord Cromwell, Sir John Oldcastle the Lord Cobham, The Puritan Widow, A Yorkshire Tragedy, and The Tragedy of Locrine. Again, these were put into the complete works of Shakespeare, but they almost all had been printed in quarto form first with Shakespeare's name or initials on them. Not that they belonged to Shakespeare, but somebody was making some money off of Shakespeare's name. So are you a die-hard Shakespeare enthusiast? If so, you may want to check out some of these plays and look into the aspects of Shakespeare that don't often get discussed. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.